The encounter. It was a cold, quiet night in the small town of Ridgewood. The stars were scattered across the dark sky like glitter, and the forest just outside town was still, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Jake, a 17-year-old boy with a sense of curiosity too big for his own good, was walking home from his friend's house. He loved taking the shortcut through the woods, even though his parents always told him to stick to the main road. To Jake, the forest was peaceful, a place where he could think. As Jake walked along the narrow dirt path, his flashlight's beam danced across the trees. Suddenly, he stopped. Ahead, in the distance, he saw something strange, a faint, glowing light coming from deeper in the woods. It was not the kind of light from a street lamp or a flashlight. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, and shifted between blue and green. "What is that?" Jake whispered to himself. His heart raced, but his curiosity pushed him forward. Carefully, he stepped off the path and into the trees, following the glow. With each step, the light grew brighter, and the air around him felt warmer. The forest was eerily silent now, as if it were holding its breath. Finally, Jake reached a small clearing. There, in the middle of the open space, was the source of the light. It was a strange, oval-shaped object, about the size of a car, hovering a few feet above the ground. Its surface shimmered like liquid metal, and strange symbols glowed faintly along its edges. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was nothing he had ever seen before. Before he could take another step, a voice came from behind him. "Shh, don't move," it whispered, soft but firm. Jake froze. He turned his head slowly and saw her, a girl about his age, with silver hair that shimmered in the dim light and large, glowing violet eyes. She was dressed in a strange suit that looked like it was made of woven light. Her expression was a mix of fear and determination. Who are you?" Jake stammered, taking a cautious step back. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? But the girl's eyes, her strange outfit, and the hovering object told him this was no joke. The girl stepped closer and raised a finger to her lips. "Please, be quiet," she said. "Promise me you won't tell anyone what you saw here. This has to stay a secret." Jake blinked, his mind racing. "Why? What's going on? What is that thing?" he asked, pointing at the glowing object. His voice shook, but he couldn't stop the questions from pouring out. The girl looked over her shoulder, scanning the woods as if she expected something, or someone, to appear. "It's not safe to talk here," she said urgently. "They might find us." She grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him further into the trees, away from the glowing object. Jake resisted at first, his instincts screaming at him to run back home. But there was something in the girl's eyes, a mix of desperation and trust, that made him stay. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice now a whisper. The girl stopped and looked at him, her expression softening. "I'll explain everything, but you have to promise you won't tell anyone. No one. Not your parents, not your friends. No one can know." Jake hesitated. This was insane. He didn't even know who this girl was or where she came from, but something about her felt real, genuine. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Okay, I promise. But you owe me an explanation." The girl let out a small sigh of relief. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Zia. I'm not from here. I mean, not from Earth." Jake's eyes widened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud was different. "You're an alien?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zia nodded. "Yes, and if they find me, they'll destroy everything." Her voice broke slightly, and for the first time, Jake noticed how scared she truly was. Before Jake could ask another question, a sharp, high-pitched sound pierced the air. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Zia's face went pale. "They're here," she whispered. Jake's heart pounded as Zia grabbed his hand and pulled him deeper into the forest. The glowing object in the clearing dimmed and vanished, leaving only darkness behind. As they ran, Jake realized he had stepped into something far bigger than himself. He didn't know who or what was chasing Zia, but one thing was clear: his life was never going to be the same. Trust and revelation. The forest was still dark when Jake and Zia finally stopped running. They had left the glowing object far behind, and now the only sounds were their ragged breaths and the soft rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Jake bent over, resting his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. "I need answers," Jake said, looking up at Zia. His flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the space between them. "You dragged me out here and said I can't tell anyone, but I don't even know who you are. What's going on?" Zia glanced around nervously, her glowing violet eyes scanning the trees. After a long pause, she finally relaxed, leaning against a tree. "I know this is strange," she began softly, "but I didn't have a choice. If they find me, I'm in danger. And so is anyone who helps me." Jake crossed his arms. "I figured that much. But who are they?" Zia hesitated, biting her lip. The faint light of Jake's flashlight flickered across her silver hair, making her look even more otherworldly. "My people," she said quietly. "I ran away from them." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me you're on the run from aliens. Why would you run away from your own kind?" Zia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because I found something I wasn't supposed to," she replied. "Something that could change everything." Jake squinted at her, unsure if she was being dramatic or serious. "Like what?" Zia glanced down at the device in her hand, a small, smooth metallic sphere that pulsed with faint blue light. "This," she said, holding it up. "It's a piece of technology that my people created. They see it as dangerous, but I know it could help others. It has the power to protect entire worlds." Jake stepped closer, curiosity overcoming his fear. "Protect from what?" "From them," Zia answered, her voice lowering. "My people don't believe in mercy. They conquer, they take, and if a planet refuses to surrender, they destroy it." Jake's eyes widened. He suddenly felt much smaller standing there in the dark woods, face to face with a girl who claimed to be part of something far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. "So, why Earth?" he asked, his voice softer now. Zia smiled faintly. "Because Earth isn't like the other planets we've seen. Your people, humans, you're unpredictable. You fight for things, even when it seems hopeless. There's something different about you." Jake wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or scared. "And your people don't like that?" "No," Zia said, shaking her head. "They see unpredictability as dangerous. But I think it's your greatest strength." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. "Okay, let me get this straight. You stole some super weapon or whatever from your people, ran to Earth because you think humans are different, and now the same aliens who want to destroy other worlds are chasing you down." Zia nodded. "That's the short version." Jake exhaled slowly. "Well, that's a lot to take in." "I know," Zia said, looking at him with something close to regret. "But I had no choice. You're the first human I've talked to since I got here." Jake frowned. "Wait, how long have you been here?" Zia shifted, avoiding his gaze. "A few days." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "You've been wandering around for days, and no one noticed." Zia smiled faintly. "Humans don't exactly expect to see aliens walking around. I've been careful." Jake sighed. "This is crazy. But if what you're saying is true, then I guess I can't just leave you out here." Zia's eyes brightened with relief. "Thank you, Jake. I know I'm asking a lot, but I promise I won't be here long. I just need to figure out how to hide this." She gestured to the glowing sphere. Jake nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, you're not exactly blending in with all that glowing and silver hair." Zia laughed softly. "I know. I can tone it down a little." As she spoke, the glowing symbols along her outfit faded, and her silver hair shifted to a darker shade, blending into the shadows. Jake's jaw dropped. "You can change your appearance." "Only a little," Zia admitted. "It's part of the tech in my suit. But it won't fool my people if they get close." Jake glanced around nervously. "And what happens if they do?" Zia's expression darkened. "Then we run." Jake wasn't sure how he had ended up in this situation, but one thing was clear. He was now involved in something far bigger than himself. Whatever was coming, he had a feeling his quiet life in Ridgewood was over. Zia looked at him with gratitude and a hint of trust. "For now, we should keep moving. They might still be nearby." Jake nodded. "Yeah, let's go." As they disappeared deeper into the woods, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Danger arrives. The walk back through the forest felt longer than it should have. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made Jake glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see strange figures emerging from the shadows. Zia stayed close to him, her footsteps nearly silent. Despite her calm exterior, Jake could sense the tension in her. She kept glancing around, scanning the woods as if expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods. Jake's house stood just a few hundred yards away, the warm glow of the porch light barely visible through the trees. He exhaled in relief. "We're almost there," he said, more to himself than to Zia. But as they stepped closer to the clearing, Zia suddenly grabbed his arm, pulling him back behind a tree. "Wait," she whispered. Her voice was sharp, urgent. Jake's heart jumped. "What? What is it?" Zia pointed toward his house. Through the branches, Jake saw something that made his stomach drop. Two dark figures stood near the edge of his backyard, their silhouettes barely visible against the faint glow from the house. They weren't moving, just standing there as if they were watching. "Who are they?" Jake whispered, though he already had a feeling he knew the answer. Zia's grip on his arm tightened. "They're scouts. My people," she said quietly. "They found me." Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do we do?" Zia glanced around quickly, pulling Jake deeper into the woods. "We can't go to your house. If they see you with me, they'll assume you're helping. And that's not good." Jake's pulse quickened. He had no idea how dangerous these aliens were, but if Zia's fear was any indication, getting caught was not an option. "Where do we go then?" Zia paused, thinking. "Somewhere far from here. Is there anywhere else nearby we can hide?" Jake thought for a moment, his mind racing. Then it hit him. The old mill. It's abandoned. No one's been there for years. It's on the other side of the creek, about a mile away. Zia nodded. "Lead the way." They moved quickly but quietly, weaving through the trees as Jake tried to stay on course. He knew these woods well, but everything felt different now. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. As they reached the creek, Jake slowed down, stepping carefully across the rocks to avoid slipping. Zia followed closely behind, moving gracefully despite the uneven terrain. But just as they reached the far side, Jake heard it, the soft hum of something unnatural, faint but growing louder. He stopped, his eyes widening as a sleek, black, drone-like object floated through the trees behind them. "Zia." Jake's voice trembled as he pointed at the drone. She turned and froze. The drone emitted a faint red light from its center, scanning the area. Zia's expression hardened. "They're tracking me," she said, her voice tense. "We have to move now." Without waiting for Jake's response, she grabbed his hand and pulled him into a sprint. The drone followed, weaving between the trees effortlessly, closing the distance. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "What happens if it catches us?" He gasped between breaths. Zia's eyes flickered with worry. "It won't. I won't let it." As they approached the mill, Jake could see the rusted remains of the old building standing tall against the night sky. The doors were broken, hanging loosely on their hinges. Zia didn't slow down, pulling Jake inside and quickly moving toward the farthest corner. The interior was dark and damp, the smell of rotting wood filling the air. Jake crouched beside Zia, listening intently. Outside, the faint hum of the drone grew louder until it hovered just outside the mill's entrance. Zia pulled out the small sphere she had shown Jake earlier. "Hold this," she whispered, handing it to him. Jake hesitated, but took it. The sphere felt warm in his hands, pulsing gently. "What is it going to do?" Zia didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand toward the entrance, and her fingertips glowed faintly. The drone hesitated, its red light flickering. Then, after a moment, it drifted away, disappearing into the woods. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "What did you do?" "I scrambled its sensors," Zia replied quietly. "But it won't last long. We need to stay out of sight until morning." Jake nodded, leaning back against the cold wall. His mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. He glanced at Zia, who was staring at the entrance, her face shadowed but calm. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Jake asked. Zia gave a faint smile. "More times than I'd like to admit." Jake looked down at the glowing sphere in his hands. "And this? Why did you give it to me?" Zia's gaze softened. "Because I trust you. And if something happens to me, you need to keep it safe." Jake didn't like the sound of that. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said firmly. Zia smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. As the night stretched on, Jake knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The secret weapon. The sky was beginning to lighten by the time Jake and Zia left the old mill. The pale glow of dawn crept through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. They had spent the night huddled in silence, listening for the faint hum of drones that, thankfully, never returned. Jake was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. He glanced over at Zia as they carefully navigated through the woods. She seemed calm, but he could tell she hadn't slept. There was something distant about her gaze, as if she was carrying a weight far heavier than anything she had led on. "You sure they're gone?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "For now," Zia replied. Her voice was soft, but firm. "They'll search somewhere else, but they won't give up." Jake frowned. "So, what do we do now? We can't hide forever." Zia stopped walking and looked at him. "No, we can't. But I need to find a way to destroy their tracking systems. As long as they can detect me, we'll never be safe." Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the small metallic sphere still tucked into his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, watching as the faint blue glow pulsed steadily beneath his fingers. "This thing, it's important, isn't it?" Zia nodded. "More than you realize." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "That sphere holds the design for something my people fear. It's not a weapon in the traditional sense. It's more like a key." "A key?" Jake asked, tilting his head. Zia crouched down, motioning for Jake to sit beside her. As they settled on the forest floor, she reached for the sphere and held it between them. In the wrong hands, this key could unlock technology capable of devastating entire planets, but in the right hands, it can do the opposite: protect them. Her fingers glided across the surface, causing a thin holographic image to flicker above it. Jake's eyes widened as the projection unfolded before him, showing what looked like a massive, shield-like structure surrounding a planet. Strange symbols spun around it, and faint lines connected various points across the projection. This is some kind of defense system?" Jake asked, watching as the projection shifted to show alien ships approaching the shield, only to be repelled by bursts of energy. Zia nodded. "It's an ancient design, lost to most of my people. I found it by accident during one of our expeditions. When I tried to present it, they dismissed it as dangerous. They believe that no planet should have that kind of protection. It disrupts the balance of power." Jake narrowed his eyes. So they'd rather keep conquering planets than give them a way to fight back. Exactly, Zaya said quietly. That's why I stole it. I couldn't let something this important disappear. Jake stared at the glowing projection, the weight of Zaya's words sinking in. He wasn't a soldier, or a scientist, or anyone important. He was just a high school kid from Ridgewood. But somehow, he was now holding the key to technology that could change the fate of planets. So, why give this to me? He asked, glancing at Zia. Why not hide it yourself? Zia hesitated, then looked him directly in the eyes. Because if something happens to me, they won't think to look for it with a human. You're my best chance of keeping it safe. Jake's grip on the sphere tightened. I don't know if I'm the right guy for this. I mean, I've never even left Earth. Zia smiled faintly. You're more capable than you think, Jake. Sometimes, the ones who make the biggest difference aren't the strongest or the smartest. They're the ones who choose to stand up when no one else will. Jake felt a strange sense of pride at her words, but it was quickly overshadowed by the growing realization of what lay ahead. Before he could respond, a distant crack echoed through the forest. Zia's head snapped toward the sound, and her eyes narrowed. They're closer than I thought, she said, standing up quickly. Jake followed her lead, pocketing the sphere. What now? Zia's gaze drifted toward the far end of the woods. We need to move. There's a place I've been trying to reach, a location I marked before I came to Earth. It's hidden from my people's sensors, but it's far from here. Jake exhaled sharply. How far? Zia's expression was grim. 200 miles. Jake's eyes widened. 200 miles. How are we supposed to get there without getting caught? Zia smiled faintly. I have a plan. But you're not going to like it. Jake groaned. I already don't like it. She laughed softly. Good. That means you're ready. As they began moving deeper into the forest, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet, ordinary life was slipping further and further away. But for some reason, he didn't mind. Because for the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something that could actually make a difference. The bond deepens. The sun was beginning to set by the time Jake and Zia emerged from the woods, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel of an old service road. The day had passed in tense silence, both of them too focused on staying hidden to speak much. Now, as the sky burned orange and purple, the air between them felt heavier, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of unspoken thoughts. Jake wiped sweat from his brow, glancing over at Zia, who walked beside him with her eyes fixed ahead. Despite the long trek, she didn't seem tired. If anything, she looked more focused than ever. You never really stop, do you? Jake finally said, breaking the quiet. Zia gave him a small smile. When you're being hunted by your own people, taking a break isn't exactly an option. Jake chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. Guess that makes sense. Still, you've been here for days. Haven't you slept at all? I can go a little longer without rest, Zia replied, glancing at him. Your body will give out long before mine does. Jake raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of saying I'm weak? Zia laughed softly, shaking her head. No, it's my way of saying you're human, and that's not a bad thing. They walked in silence for a few moments, the tension easing slightly. You know, Jake began, slowing his pace, I've been thinking. You talk a lot about how dangerous your people are, but I don't understand why they're chasing you so hard over this. He patted the pocket where the sphere sat. I mean, I get that it's important, but why does it feel personal? Zia's expression shifted, her smile fading. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light. Because it is personal, she said quietly. The leader of the group tracking me. He's my brother. Jake's eyes widened. Wait, what? Zia crossed her arms, leaning against a rusted guardrail that lined the service road. His name is Cal. He's one of the highest-ranking officers in the fleet. When I took the sphere and fled, he volunteered to lead the search personally. Jake tried to process this new information. Your own brother is chasing you down like this. Why? Zia's gaze lowered. He believes he's protecting our people by stopping me. Kale has always been loyal to our leaders, even when he disagrees with them. He thinks if I hand the sphere over, I'll be spared. Jake leaned against the rail beside her. And you don't believe that? Zia shook her head. No. They see me as a traitor. Even if I surrendered, that wouldn't let me live. Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. That's heavy. I can't imagine being in your shoes, family turning against you like that. Zia looked at him, her eyes softening. It's not easy, but I made my choice. I couldn't stand by while they continued conquering worlds that couldn't defend themselves. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the evening filled the air, insects buzzing faintly in the distance. You're braver than I thought, Jake said, nudging her lightly. Zia smiled again, but there was a flicker of sadness behind her eyes. You give me too much credit. I'm just trying to do the right thing. Jake glanced down the road, the faint outline of a small cabin coming into view just beyond the trees. Well, for what it's worth, I think you made the right call. Zia followed his gaze, nodding. We should stop there for the night. The sun will be down soon, and I don't want to risk moving after dark. As they approached the cabin, Jake couldn't shake the strange feeling building in his chest. The more time he spent with Zia, the more he realized how much she had given up, and how much she was still willing to sacrifice. After they settled inside, Zia leaned by the window, peering out into the darkening woods. Jake sat nearby, resting against an old armchair. Do you miss them? Jake asked suddenly. Zia didn't turn from the window. Who? Your family. Your brother. Zia's shoulders tensed slightly. I do. Every day. But missing them doesn't change the fact that they chose a different path. One I couldn't follow. Jake hesitated. Maybe he still cares. Maybe Cal's just doing what he thinks he has to. Zia's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Maybe. But I can't afford to take that risk. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt more comfortable, as if the weight between them had shifted. I'll keep this safe, Jake said, tapping his pocket. I promise. Zia finally turned, her expression softening. I know you will. That's why I gave it to you. As the stars appeared one by one outside the cabin, Jake realized something else. He wasn't just helping Zia because he felt responsible. He was helping her because he believed in what she was fighting for. The final stand. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Jake sat near the old fireplace, poking at the dying embers with a rusted iron rod. The faint crackle of burning wood filled the space, but it did little to ease the knot tightening in his chest. Across the room, Zia remained by the window, peering into the night like a statue carved from shadow. Her silver hair shimmered faintly under the moonlight filtering through the cracked glass, and her violet eyes glowed softly, scanning the woods beyond. Jake shifted in his seat, glancing at the sphere tucked safely in his jacket pocket. Its gentle pulse radiated warmth against his chest, a quiet reminder of the responsibility now resting squarely on his shoulders. You've been standing there for over an hour, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you really think they'll find us out here? Zia's gaze didn't waver. I know they will, she replied calmly. It's not a matter of if. They're already close. Jake's heart skipped. He sat up straight, clutching the sphere protectively. How close? Zia finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Close enough. A cold chill crept down Jake's spine. He stood, pacing the small room. So, what do we do? Wait here until they break down the door. There's got to be something. A sudden sharp hum echoed from somewhere outside the cabin, cutting Jake off mid-sentence. It wasn't the natural sound of the forest or wind through the trees. This was mechanical, alien. Jake's eyes darted to Zia. She didn't move. Her shoulders tensed, but she remained calm, as if she had been expecting this all along. "They found us," she whispered. The hum grew louder, followed by a second, deeper noise that sounded almost like a low-frequency growl. Jake's palms grew sweaty as he grabbed the nearest object, a wooden chair, as if that would somehow protect him. "Do they know we're in here?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Zia stepped away from the window, nodding. "Yes." Jake swore under his breath. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Zia walked toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light but reassuring. "You stay behind me," she said firmly. "No matter what happens." Jake swallowed. "I don't like that plan." Before Zia could respond, a sudden beam of red light swept across the cabin's exterior, piercing through the cracks in the wooden walls. Jake instinctively ducked, heart hammering in his chest. "They're scanning for life signs," Zia explained. "Their technology is precise, but not foolproof. We might still have time to avoid." The front door rattled violently, the old hinges groaning under the pressure of something unseen. Jake backed away. "Yeah, I think we're past that part." The door shuddered again, and this time, a faint blue light began seeping through the cracks. "Move," Zia hissed, grabbing Jake's wrist and pulling him toward the back of the cabin. She pressed her palm against the wooden wall, and to Jake's surprise, the surface shimmered for a brief second before parting like a sliding door. "Whoa, when did the wall learn to do that?" Jake asked, stumbling into what appeared to be a concealed tunnel beneath the cabin. "I installed it last night while you were sleeping," Zia said, guiding him down the narrow passage. "I had a feeling we'd need it." Jake barely had time to appreciate Zia's foresight before the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. The aliens had breached the cabin. Zia paused, turning toward him with urgency in her eyes. "Jake, listen carefully. This tunnel leads to the base of the hill. Keep going. Don't stop until you reach the road." Jake froze. "Wait, what about you? You're not coming." "I'll draw them away," Zia said firmly. "They're after me, not you. If I can distract them long enough, you can escape with the sphere." Jake's heart pounded. "No way, I'm not leaving you behind. We're in this together, remember." Zia hesitated, her expression softening. "Jake." "No," he interrupted, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm not running. Not without you." For a moment, they stood there, locked in silence. Then, to Jake's surprise, Zia smiled. "You really are different," she said quietly. Before Jake could respond, the tunnel behind them trembled, dust raining down from the ceiling. The aliens were closing in. "Fine," Zia relented. "But stay close, and if anything happens, you run." Jake nodded. "Deal." They hurried down the tunnel, the faint hum of alien technology growing louder behind them. As they neared the end, a faint glow appeared at the tunnel's exit. A single alien drone hovered there, scanning the area. Zia raised her hand, her fingertips glowing faintly. "Stay here," she whispered. Before Jake could protest, Zia stepped into the open, allowing the drone to lock onto her position. The machine emitted a loud, shrill noise, preparing to alert the others. With a swift motion, Zia unleashed a pulse of energy from her palm, striking the drone and sending it crashing into the underbrush. Jake ran to her side, his heart racing. "I thought you were trying not to get caught." "That wasn't the plan," Zia admitted with a grin, "but sometimes plans change." The sound of more drones approached in the distance, but this time, Jake wasn't afraid. For the first time, he felt ready. Ready to fight. Ready to stand beside Zia. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about both of them. A new beginning. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, bathing the forest in soft golden light. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint hum of alien drones retreating into the distance. Jake sat on the edge of a mossy log, catching his breath as Zia knelt beside the wreckage of the last drone she had brought down. Sparks flickered from its shattered core, the faint glow of its sensors slowly dimming. "They're gone," Jake said, wiping sweat from his brow. Zia nodded, brushing her silver hair back. "For now. But they'll be back." Jake glanced at the horizon, the calm forest betraying no sign of the battle that had just unfolded. It felt surreal, like waking from a strange dream, except the weight of the sphere in his jacket pocket reminded him that it had all been real. "They're relentless," Jake muttered. "It's like they won't stop until they find you." "They won't," Zia said quietly. "Not as long as I have this." She gestured toward the sphere in Jake's pocket. Jake frowned, shifting uneasily. "Then why don't we destroy it? If this thing is what they're after, wouldn't that stop them?" Zia looked at him, her violet eyes filled with something Jake hadn't seen before, hope, but also sadness. "Destroying it wouldn't stop them. They'd keep searching, thinking I hid another copy somewhere. And worse, it would mean we'd lose the only chance to protect Earth and other planets like it." Jake stared at the ground, the weight of her words sinking in. "So, what now? We can't just keep running forever." Zia stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "No, we can't. That's why I need to leave." Jake's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" Zia gave him a soft smile, but there was something distant in her expression. "My people will keep looking for me. And if I stay here, they'll eventually find Earth. I can't let that happen." Jake stood quickly, shaking his head. "Hold on. You're just going to leave. After everything we've been through. It's not goodbye forever," Zia said gently. "But I need to lead them away. There's a colony a few systems from here, hidden off their radar. If I go there, it will buy time." Jake's chest tightened. He wasn't sure why he felt this way. He hadn't known Zia for long, but the thought of her leaving left a pit in his stomach. "What about the sphere?" Jake asked after a long pause. Zia stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on his chest, where the sphere sat hidden in his pocket. "You keep it," she said. "It's safer with you. If anything happens to me, you'll be the one to decide what to do with it." Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing. "But I don't know the first thing about alien technology or fighting intergalactic fleets. I'm just me." Zia smiled. "That's why I trust you. You're not like them. You see the value in protecting others, even when it's dangerous. That's exactly the kind of person who should have this." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he just nodded, feeling the sphere's gentle pulse beneath his hand. "How will I know if you're okay?" he finally asked. Zia tilted her head, her glowing eyes meeting his. "I'll find a way. When it's safe, I'll come back." The forest around them was quiet now, the sun rising higher in the sky. Zia took a step back, and for a brief moment, Jake thought she might change her mind. But she didn't. As she activated a small device on her wrist, a faint blue shimmer surrounded her, distorting the air around her like ripples in water. "Jake," Zia said softly, just before the shimmer fully engulfed her. "Thank you for everything." And then she was gone, the forest returning to silence, as if she had never been there at all. Jake stood alone for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been. The sphere in his pocket pulsed steadily, a quiet reminder that this wasn't over. He took a deep breath, glancing toward the rising sun. "I'll be here," he whispered. And as he turned to make his way back toward town, he knew this was only the beginning.